A racist cop unleashed a K-9 unit on a young black girl, thinking she was just some trespasser with no one to back her up. What he didn't realize was that her father was the president of the country. When the truth came out, everything changed in a way no one expected. It started like an ordinary day, but one officer's bias and arrogance turned it into a shocking event. A young girl stood her ground, even as the officer made a terrible choice. What happened next? A single phone call changed everything and left the officer panicking like never before. The cop was so sure of his authority, confident that no one would question his actions. But he didn't expect the girl to have the power to turn the tables completely. Witnesses were stunned as the truth unfolded, and the officer realized he had made the biggest mistake of his career. This isn't just about one incident. It's about what happens when someone abuses their power, and the lesson they learn when their actions have consequences. It's a story that shows how bias and assumptions can lead to regret. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. Keep watching as we dive into a story that will leave you speechless. Are you ready to find out what happened next? The officer commanded his K-9 unit to bark aggressively at the young girl, certain that his authority would go unquestioned. To him, she was just another easy target, someone who couldn't push back. What he didn't realize was that the teenager standing before him wasn't ordinary. She carried a calm confidence that hinted at a strength he hadn't anticipated, and her identity would soon flip his world upside down. She was a teenager with a reputation for standing firm against injustice, humble and approachable. Despite her privileged background, she had earned the respect of those who knew her. Her advocacy for equality and fairness had made her a voice of reason, even at such a young age. But today, her sense of justice clashed with a man whose actions embodied the discrimination she often fought against. The officer, on the other hand, was infamous for his behavior. With a long history of targeting marginalized groups and using excessive force, he thrived on his power and the fear it inspired. He believed his badge gave him the right to intimidate, and he never hesitated to misuse his authority. In this moment, he thought he was in control, certain that this encounter would end the same way it always did, with him exerting dominance. But this was no ordinary situation. The girl he sought to intimidate wasn't defenseless, and the consequences of his actions were closer than he could imagine. As he tightened his grip on control, he had no idea that her background and who she was connected to would soon leave him scrambling for answers and regretting his every move. As the officer stood there, his posture radiating arrogance, he tightened his grip on the leash of the barking K-9. The girl remained calm, her gaze steady, despite the intimidating growls. The officer had no idea who he was dealing with. He thought this was just another easy power play, one he would control entirely. He stopped in front of her, demanding to know why she was there. His voice was sharp, commanding, and full of disdain. "What are you doing around here?" he snapped. His tone carried an air of accusation, as if she didn't belong in that neighborhood, in that space, or even in that moment. The girl tried to answer, keeping her voice measured and polite, but he cut her off. "I didn't ask for excuses," he barked, glaring down at her. His K-9 barked again, its sharp growls adding to the tension in the air. The officer assumed she would falter, back down, and submit to his intimidation. But to his frustration, she remained composed, giving no sign of fear. He demanded her identification, and she calmly handed over her student ID, explaining that she was visiting the area for a project. The officer barely glanced at the card before sneering. "This isn't good enough," he muttered. tossing the ID back at her feet. "Don't lie to me," he said harshly, leaning in closer as if to assert his dominance. "You're trespassing here. I should arrest you right now." The girl picked up her ID from the ground, her expression calm but firm. "I'm not trespassing," she said softly, her words clear and unwavering. "I'm here for a valid reason, and if you check the facts, you'll see I have every right to be here." Her words only seemed to fuel his anger. The officer stepped back and pointed to his K-9, now growling louder. "I'll decide what's valid," he spat. "People like you always have a reason, don't you? Always trying to talk your way out of things." It was clear to everyone watching that the officer was using his authority to escalate the situation. Nearby onlookers began whispering among themselves, uneasy with what they were witnessing. But even as the tension grew, the girl's demeanor didn't change. She stood tall, her quiet strength disarming, though the officer didn't see it that way. He believed he was winning, that his intimidation was working. He thought he could force her to admit to something she hadn't done, just as he had done so many times before. What he couldn't see was that his arrogance was leading him straight into a trap of his own making. Unbeknownst to him, the girl had already sent a quick message before the confrontation began. Help was on the way, and soon the officer's entire perception of power would shift. He was about to find out just how badly he had misjudged her. The officer's barking K-9 and his domineering tone filled the tense air. The girl remained steadfast, clutching her ID, knowing she had done nothing wrong. Though she appeared composed on the surface, her quick message to her father, one sent moments before the confrontation escalated, was a silent beacon for the help that was surely on its way. The officer smirked, his arrogance practically radiating, as he called for backup, clearly preparing to make an example of her. "Let's see how you talk your way out of this one," he said coldly, motioning to the K-9, whose growls grew louder. The girl maintained her calm, quietly reminding herself to stand her ground. "Sir, I've done nothing wrong," she stated firmly but respectfully. "I've shown you my ID, and you can confirm my identity easily. There's no reason for this to continue." But her words only seemed to make him angrier. "You think you can tell me how to do my job?" he snapped. "People like you always have excuses." He didn't even bother to hide the bias in his tone. "You're out of place here, and it's my job to make sure this neighborhood stays safe." The onlookers, many of whom had been watching silently, began murmuring more audibly. Some took out their phones, recording the exchange as the officer continued to berate the girl. His words were laced with prejudice, and those in the growing crowd couldn't ignore how misplaced his aggression was. As the tension built, the girl's quiet strength began to shine through. She took a deep breath and spoke calmly but firmly. "Officer, I'm giving you a chance to reconsider what you're doing. I haven't resisted. I've cooperated fully. But this behavior, your refusal to verify my ID and your threats, it's not justifiable." Her words carried a weight that seemed to hang in the air, but the officer wasn't listening. His focus was on asserting his dominance, oblivious to the fact that his every move was being documented by witnesses. "I don't take orders from you," he barked, his hand resting on the K-9's leash, as if ready to unleash the dog at any moment. "You're lucky I haven't arrested you yet." The girl's calm expression didn't falter, but inside she felt a deep frustration. She knew the truth would come to light soon, but watching the officer misuse his authority so blatantly was still difficult. Her heart raced, but she reminded herself to stay composed. Help was coming. Her father would see to that. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder as a sleek black SUV approached the scene. Heads turned as the vehicle pulled up, and the officer's confidence wavered for the first time. The girl glanced toward the SUV, a hint of relief flickering in her eyes. She knew this would be the moment everything changed. The officer, however, remained oblivious. He was too consumed by his own arrogance to realize the mistake he had made, or the powerful individual he was about to confront. As the SUV door opened, the crowd fell silent. All eyes were now on the new arrival, and the officer's smugness began to crack. He had no idea how much his actions would cost him. The sleek black SUV idled at the edge of the tense scene, its polished exterior gleaming under the sunlight. Onlookers instinctively quieted, their gazes shifting between the towering officer, the barking K-9, and the girl whose calm demeanor seemed almost unshakable. Inside, however, her heart was pounding as she watched the vehicle door slowly open. She knew this moment would change everything. The officer glanced toward the SUV but dismissed it just as quickly, assuming it was another bystander coming to gawk at the commotion. "Mind your business," he barked at the crowd, his hand tightening on the leash of the growling dog. "I've got this under control." The girl stood firm, her voice steady as she spoke again. "Officer, I suggest you take a moment to verify who you're dealing with before things escalate any further." Her words carried a weight that seemed out of place for someone her age, but the officer ignored her. "Stop talking," he snapped. "I've heard enough from you." His confidence hadn't yet wavered, bolstered by years of unchecked authority. He didn't notice the subtle shift in the crowd as the SUV's passengers stepped out. The tension hung thick in the air, and for the first time, it was directed at the officer. The woman who exited the vehicle moved with quiet authority, her presence commanding attention without a single word. She was impeccably dressed, exuding both power and control. As she approached, the murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and the officer finally turned his head to see what had caused the stir. "What's going on here?" The woman's voice was calm, but carried an undeniable authority. Her piercing gaze fell on the officer, who stiffened at her approach. He squinted, trying to place the face that was now mere steps away from him. The girl's lips curved into the faintest hint of a knowing smile, though she remained silent. "And who are you supposed to be?" the officer asked, his tone dripping with irritation as he struggled to reassert his dominance. The woman stopped just short of the officer, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. She tilted her head slightly, as if surprised by the question. "I think you should be asking yourself that, officer," she replied, her voice even and measured. "Do you know who you've been harassing?" The girl finally broke her silence, her tone still calm. "Officer, this is your chance to explain why you've refused to verify my identification, why you've escalated this situation unnecessarily, and why you're using this dog as a threat." The officer hesitated, his grip tightening on the K-9's leash. "I don't need to explain anything to you," he growled. "You're out here causing trouble, and it's my job to handle it. I don't care who you think you are." The woman raised an eyebrow, her expression remaining neutral. "Handle it?" By ignoring proper protocol and threatening an innocent civilian, she motioned toward the phone in her hand. "This entire interaction is being recorded, officer. I trust you're confident enough in your actions to let them stand up to scrutiny." The officer's bravado began to falter as the weight of her words sank in. His eyes darted to the crowd, where several people were still recording. The girl stepped forward slightly, her calm yet commanding presence matching the woman's. "You had the chance to handle this the right way," she said softly, "but instead you chose intimidation and prejudice." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective disapproval growing louder. The officer's face reddened, his frustration now mixed with panic. He glanced back at the woman who had pulled out a badge from her pocket. It gleamed in the sunlight, its significance unmistakable. The woman's tone remained steady as she spoke. "Officer, let me reintroduce myself. I am the president of this country, and this is my daughter." Her words landed like a thunderclap, silencing the crowd and leaving the officer visibly stunned. The girl met the officer's wide-eyed gaze with quiet defiance. "Now, do you understand the gravity of your actions?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. The officer opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His arrogance had completely melted away, replaced by sheer disbelief. The K-9, sensing its handler's unease, finally stopped barking and sat down, its growls silenced. The woman turned to the crowd, addressing them with the same calm authority. "Thank you all for bearing witness to this incident. Let it serve as a reminder that no one, no matter their position or authority, is above accountability. This officer's behavior will be addressed, and justice will be served." The crowd erupted into applause and cheers, their support directed toward the girl and her mother. The officer stood frozen, his face pale, as the reality of his situation settled in. He had targeted the wrong person, and now he would face the consequences. The girl exchanged a brief, meaningful glance with her mother before stepping forward. "This is more than just about me," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This is about standing up against injustice, no matter where it comes from." With the crowd rallying behind her, the officer's once confident demeanor was now nothing more than a distant memory. The scene was still buzzing with energy as the president's daughter and her mother, the nation's leader, stood firm in front of the officer, who had made the grave mistake of targeting the wrong person. The echoes of the crowd's cheers still lingered in the air, serving as a powerful backdrop to the officer's growing unease. The weight of his actions bore down on him like a storm he could no longer control. His once confident smirk had long disappeared, replaced by visible regret and panic. As the officer struggled to process the gravity of his actions, the president's voice rang out again, clear and commanding. "You have shown us how power can be abused, but today, accountability begins. Your actions won't go unnoticed, and justice will prevail." Her words were met with more applause, reinforcing the solidarity of the crowd. The officer, now visibly shaken, managed to stammer, "I didn't know. I wasn't aware." But his excuses fell flat. The president's piercing gaze stopped him cold. "Ignorance is no excuse for injustice," she replied. "What you didn't know is that you were harassing someone who could see right through your abuse of power. You've not just failed her, you've failed your badge." The girl, who had remained calm and composed throughout the ordeal, stepped forward. "This isn't just about you, officer," she said, her tone steady and unwavering. "This is about a system that allows people like you to act with impunity. Today, we're taking a stand. Not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been targeted unfairly." The officer hung his head as murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The tension was palpable, but so was the shift in power. The girl's quiet strength and her mother's authoritative presence had turned the tables entirely. The president turned her attention to the onlookers, her voice addressing the broader implications of what had just unfolded. "This moment is bigger than any one person," she declared. "It's about ensuring that no one, no matter their background, feels powerless in the face of authority. This is what justice looks like." The girl glanced at her mother and nodded subtly, signaling her agreement. Together, they embodied the strength and resilience needed to challenge an unjust system. The crowd, moved by their words and actions, erupted into a chorus of cheers and applause once more. As the officer stood silently, Grappling with the full weight of his situation, his radio crackled to life. A voice on the other end urgently called his name, but he ignored it, unable to tear himself away from the scene unraveling before him. He knew this was the end of his unchecked authority. The girl and her mother had made sure of that. The president turned back to her daughter, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've shown incredible courage today," she said, her voice warm but firm. "This is just the beginning of the change we need to create. Together, we'll ensure that stories like this become a thing of the past." The girl smiled softly, her confidence bolstered by her mother's unwavering support. "We'll fight for justice, for everyone," she replied. The determination in her voice resonated with everyone present, solidifying her role as a beacon of hope in the fight against injustice. With the situation finally coming to a close, the president addressed the crowd one last time. "Thank you for standing with us today," she said. "Your voices are powerful. Together, we can dismantle the systems that allow injustice to thrive. Change begins with each of us." The crowd erupted in one final cheer as the girl and her mother walked back to their SUV. The officer, still rooted to the spot, watched them leave, his mind racing with the consequences he would now face. For the first time, he truly understood the magnitude of his actions and the cost of his prejudice. The SUV pulled away, leaving behind a scene transformed. What had started as a moment of unchecked authority had turned into a powerful stand for justice, led by a young girl and her formidable mother. The onlookers began to disperse, their conversations buzzing with newfound determination to challenge injustice wherever it arose. This was more than just an incident. It was the beginning of a movement. The president's SUV had barely disappeared from view when the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about what they had just witnessed. But for the officer standing amidst the remnants of the confrontation, the moment wasn't over. His mind replayed the president's words and her daughter's calm yet commanding stance. Shame crept over him, and the weight of his actions began to settle in ways he hadn't anticipated. What he didn't know was that the story was far from over. The president and her daughter were not ones to leave a lesson half-taught. This was a moment to create lasting change, and they intended to see it through. The officer, now feeling the pressure from the stares of a few lingering bystanders, retreated to his patrol car. The once confident demeanor that had emboldened him to misuse his authority was now replaced with nervous glances and a sense of unease. His radio crackled with updates from the station, but he was too preoccupied to respond. The incident had gone viral in a matter of minutes, and his face, along with his actions, was now plastered across social media. Meanwhile, back at the president's residence, the atmosphere was far from celebratory. The president's daughter sat with her mother in the study, their expressions thoughtful and resolute. This wasn't about one officer or one incident. It was about dismantling the system that allowed such behaviors to persist. The president leaned forward, her hands clasped. "We've exposed the issue," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Now, we need to ensure this doesn't happen again. It's time to bring the entire system into question." Her daughter nodded, her youthful determination blending seamlessly with the wisdom instilled in her by her upbringing. "We need to show people that standing up isn't just a one-time act," she replied. "It's a responsibility." The conversation shifted to their next steps. They planned to address the nation, to share their story not as a personal grievance, but as a call to action for everyone to recognize and confront systemic injustice. The president knew that using her platform, responsibly meant not only holding the officer accountable, but also shining a light on the broader issues of misuse of authority and discrimination. As the story spread, the officer found himself summoned to a disciplinary hearing. The department could no longer ignore the public outcry. Videos of the incident had garnered millions of views, and the hashtags calling for accountability showed no signs of slowing down. His superiors, who had once turned a blind eye to his misconduct, were now forced to act in the face of overwhelming evidence and pressure. At the hearing, the officer sat stiffly as a panel of senior officials reviewed the evidence. The president and her daughter were not present, but their statements were delivered with precision. The officer's history of discriminatory actions, which had been conveniently overlooked until now, was brought to light. Each word spoken was a reminder of the consequences of his unchecked behavior. The officer attempted to justify his actions, but his words rang hollow against the undeniable truth presented before the panel. His superiors, unwilling to bear the brunt of the backlash, distanced themselves from him, making it clear that he would face the consequences alone. While the hearing proceeded, the president prepared to address the nation. Cameras were set up, and a quiet sense of anticipation filled the room. When she stepped in front of the microphone, her presence commanded attention. She began not with anger, but with a message of unity and responsibility. This incident has reminded us of the power we hold when we stand together, she said, her voice steady and warm. But it has also shown us the urgent need for change. It's not enough to react after the fact. We must actively work to prevent injustice at its roots. Her words resonated deeply, and the response was immediate. Messages of support and pledges to take action flooded in. People shared their own stories, and communities began organizing to address systemic issues within their local institutions. Back at the station, the officer was formally suspended pending further investigation. The hearing had concluded, but the ripple effects of his actions were only beginning. He returned home to find himself a pariah in his own neighborhood, the weight of his choices now fully visible in the isolation he felt. The president and her daughter, meanwhile, continued to focus on the bigger picture. They launched a national initiative aimed at addressing bias and discrimination in law enforcement. Workshops, training programs, and policy reforms were proposed, each designed to create a culture of accountability and respect within the ranks of authority figures. The president's daughter took an active role in the initiative, using her platform to connect with young people. She shared her experience, not to garner sympathy, but to inspire action. "I stood up that day, not because I was fearless," she said during a public forum, "but because I knew that staying silent would only allow the problem to persist. We all have the power to make a difference." The initiative quickly gained traction, with communities across the country joining the movement. The officer's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the consequences of prejudice and the power of accountability. But it also served as a spark, igniting a nationwide conversation about respect, equality, and the responsibilities of those in positions of power. As the weeks passed, the president and her daughter saw the fruits of their efforts begin to take shape. Policies were re-examined, training programs were implemented, and the voices of the marginalized grew louder and more unified. The incident, though painful, had become a catalyst for change. For the officer, the story ended not with redemption, but with reflection. His actions had cost him his career and his reputation, but they also forced him to confront the biases that had driven him. In his quiet moments, he wondered if it was too late to change. The president's daughter, however, knew that the story was far from over. Change was a journey, not a destination, and she was ready to walk that path, no matter how long it took. This isn't just about one moment or one person, she reminded those around her. It's about creating a world where dignity and justice are not privileges but rights for everyone. Her words echoed across the nation, a beacon of hope and a reminder that even in the face of adversity, change is always possible. The story, though rooted in a moment of injustice, became a testament to the power of resilience, unity, and the unwavering pursuit of what is right. The president's daughter, deeply involved in addressing systemic discrimination, used her platform to champion reform after the officer's actions. The public's outrage led to the officer's suspension, termination, and eventual isolation, as investigations uncovered his pattern of abuse. The president's national initiative brought new policies emphasizing fairness, accountability, and de-escalation. Though it faced resistance, communities rallied, and the president's daughter became a relatable figure for young activists, inspiring nationwide efforts for justice. Together, they lobbied for independent oversight to investigate abuses and partnered with organizations to promote transparency and equality in law enforcement. The officer, now disgraced, reflected on his actions too late. Meanwhile, the family's initiative inspired not just national, but international movements, proving that standing up against injustice could create a ripple effect. Their story became a symbol of resilience, showing that even in the face of prejudice, united voices could drive meaningful change and build a fairer society.